Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be diving into a new joint white paper published by the Hoover Institute and the Stanford Internet Observatory entitled Telling China's Story, the Chinese Communist Party's Campaign to Shape Global Narratives. And there will be a link to that report in the episode description, but it's a fascinating dive into the Chinese government's influence operations, their tactics to control the information environment domestically at home for Chinese citizens, but also how they use social media and other techniques to exert sort of soft power abroad. And what's particularly interesting is the report breaks down the overt influence operations, the type of things that we can see, publicly from Chinese state media, Facebook accounts, for example. But particularly interesting is the covert operations, things like content farms, sock puppet accounts, and the infamous 50-cent commenting army. So we're going to dive into all of that. And my guest today is Vanessa Molter. She's a graduate research assistant at the Stanford Internet Observatory and one of the co-authors of that report. And she's done a lot of work looking at the Taiwanese social media landscape and particularly Chinese propaganda. So in this episode, we'll go through that report and talk about the Chinese government's influence operations with a particular focus, of course, on social media. And we'll also dive into some of the case studies that are in the report. And those include the 2019 Hong Kong protests, the 2020 Taiwanese presidential election, and the recent COVID pandemic. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Vanessa Molter. Again, she's a graduate research assistant at the Stanford Internet Observatory. Vanessa, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you, Michael. I'm excited to chat about our research and findings.
So to start out here, Telling China's Story is a report about China's on and offline influence operations, both domestically and for international audiences. And we'll dive deeper into those elements as we move along. But I think, compared to Russia or Iran, for example, Chinese influence operations tend to get less public attention. And so do you think that's the case? And why did you and your team decide to write the report now?
Yeah, so to your first question on why there has been less public attention on Chinese influence operations compared to Russia or Iran, I'd say it's a mix of a lack of sophistication in China's covert efforts and the fact that there has not been any evidence of Chinese interference in domestic affairs in far-flung countries, such as in the 2016 US presidential election, as there has been, for example, from Russia. Also, Chinese tactics and goals are significantly different from those of, for example, Russia, and that also affects how they are perceived publicly. And on why the report now, so this idea came after our monitoring of the Taiwanese presidential election that was held in January of this year. And what we saw then was not what we expected to see. So after a lot of public attention and media reports before the election saying that lots of people are expecting China trying to interfere in the election, we expected to see lots of coordinated inauthentic behavior from China, kind of a Russia-style campaign targeting the elections and Taiwanese voters. But we were surprised to find kind of a different story. And so we kept analyzing other cases, and we wanted to share our findings with others.
Definitely. And I want to get in kind of deeper into those cases later on. But before we get there, I'd like to talk a little bit about the genesis of the CCP's propaganda efforts, CCP being the Chinese Communist Party, which the report traces back to a particularly notable example relating to an epidemic in the early 1950s, which is kind of a coincidence. But could you recount that event for us and how it illustrates an early example of a CCP disinformation campaign?
Sure. So this episode occurred in 1952 in the context of the Korean War, where Chinese and North Korean troops on the one side were fighting American and South Korean ones on the other. And during the Korean War, there were outbreaks of diseases like, for example, the bubonic plague, cholera, and encephalitis in North Korea and in parts of China. And the Chinese government then alleged that the United States was engaged in germ warfare and that they were responsible for those outbreaks. And to spread this idea, the Chinese government orchestrated global outrage across Chinese propaganda outlets together with socialist allies. So part of this campaign was to, for example, publicize confessions maybe using quotation marks, from American prisoners of war, and to cultivate leftist and pacifist sympathizers that would then go and amplify those claims of germ warfare in Western media. Another part of the Chinese government's tactic was to bring in scientists sympathetic to China from different countries on a fact finding mission. And their final report mirrored pretty similarly what China had claimed had happened. And China didn't allow independent investigations by the World Health Organization or the International Committee of the Red Cross, kind of saying that they were biased against China. The claims that the US had engaged in germ warfare convinced a lot of foreigners too. And even though the United States has completely rejected the allegations, and even though the overwhelming historical evidence and scholarly opinion outside of China refutes the allegations too, even today some people continue believing them. So this whole campaign is an illustration of early Chinese disinformation tactics, in that it blended overt propaganda, like what was published in Chinese state media, with recruiting of credible foreign authorities, like the scientist report. And these methods then help legitimate CCP talking points and build up the domestic and international standing of the CCP at the expense of its adversaries.
Yeah, it's interesting how that offline element is brought in, the recruiting of experts. That really seems to be part of that strategy. And while this is an early example, and there's been a lot of other ones since then, what I took from the report is that there's these kind of mainstay pillar organizations throughout the CCP's propaganda efforts. And those are the Central Propaganda Department and the United Front. So can you describe what these organizations do and how they've adjusted their strategies kind of in line with emerging technologies?
Yeah, great question. So both the Central Propaganda Department and the United Front include various offices within the Chinese government and within the CCP, and they generally operate in secret. The Central Propaganda Department, or CPD's job, is to police print and broadcast media content, but also content online and in the arts and in education, and it also overlaps with some other state organs and responsibilities here. What the Central Propaganda Department also does is indoctrinating party members and supporting propaganda by ordinary government offices. The other pillar, the United Front, is managed by the CCP's United Front Work Department, and it takes a more kind of grassroots approach. So what the United Front tries to do is co-opt influential people and groups like business people and academics through both overt and covert activities, like, for example, through religious groups, cultural exchanges, criminal gangs, or also chambers of commerce. And in the germ warfare allegations during the Korean War that we just discussed, it was the United Front who was managing foreign supporters, who then increased the reach of the allegations.
So the Central Propaganda Department, this would be more traditional kind of broadcasting media, for example.
Correct, yes.
Okay. Because I think, what most listeners of this podcast are interested in is kind of the digital side. And I think probably the biggest threat to the CCP's message control, particularly relating to that Central Propaganda Department, has been the rise of the internet and social media. And particularly in the mid-2000s, WeChat and Weibo started to become established social media platforms in the country. And so how did these platforms affect the Chinese media landscape, and what steps did the CCP take to maintain control on the information environment?
Yeah, the rise of these social media platforms came in a context of a relatively liberal media landscape in China and kind of intensified a trend at the time of less control by the party over domestic narratives. But then, starting in the mid-2000s, the party worked to reverse this trend. And in the traditional media sphere, this meant that they replaced editors and publishers at bigger media outlets. For social media, one of the early restrictions has for a long time been censorship of specific kinds of content, like content that endangers national security or damages national honor and interests, so really broad specifications. There has been great scholarship on this topic, so it's not like some people say that the CCP just tries to, ban any kind of criticism of the party and just any type of discontent that Chinese users share gets censored. But actually, some of the stuff that Chinese citizens are sharing that they're unhappy about is really valuable to the Chinese government, like learning about smaller grievances so that they can address it, or just letting people vent a little bit in a harmless way. It's more like certain kinds of criticism that could lead to some kind of movement that gets censored. And that's been implemented more and more strictly. The Arab Spring uprisings especially reinforce this kind of worry that kind of people could use the internet for discussions that then lead to organized action in the streets. And then another increasingly restrictive policy is that the government mandates people to register on various online platforms with their real names, which of course makes it easier to track someone down and intimidate them or their family members if they're a particularly vocal critic. The extent of platforms where people need to register with their real names has successively been increased, and that means that anonymity online has been eroded more and more. And if you can't post anonymously about something and you're worried that this might be something that the government does not like to see, then maybe you're not going to post it if you know that the Ministry of Public Security can link your online account to you personally. So this real name registration also leads to some level of self-censorship. So yeah, through laws restricting what kind of content platforms can host and holding platforms liable if those laws are broken, and through such real name requirements, that's how the CCP has reasserted the control over the narrative online.
That's interesting. I'm thinking about WeChat because it's kind of well known that it's a well integrated app and that it's a social network, but it's also how people make payments. Is it through Alipay on WeChat?
WeChat Pay.
WeChat Pay, there you go. So I guess it kind of makes sense that it's tied to your person. But these measures, these laws, these were aimed at more of a domestic Chinese audience, whereas starting in 2009, Chinese state media began establishing presences on Western social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube, even though they're blocked in China, which is kind of interesting. So what type of content was being posted to these platforms, and who was the main audience for these Western social media accounts?
Yeah. So as for content, much of what we saw was pro-Chinese cheerleading, especially content praising the CCP leadership and Xi Jinping specifically. So, for example, during the coronavirus pandemic on Facebook, we would see posts saying that Xi Jinping values the lives and health of Chinese citizens, and they would show him on visits to heavily affected regions in China. And then other content kind of parrots policy goals by the Chinese government, like, for example, emphasizing that projects in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a global foreign policy initiative by the Chinese government consisting of various infrastructure projects in different countries, that these projects in the initiative are beneficial to local communities. Or content that's criticizing the Hong Kong protests and saying that the new national security law in Hong Kong, which has been highly controversial, is actually beneficial to Hong Kong citizens. And to your question on who the target audience for this content is, one thing to note is that Chinese state media accounts that they have on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook are run in different languages, which includes English and, of course, Chinese, but also French, Arabic, Spanish, and other languages. Their main focus and the bulk of attention is on their English language properties, but it would be kind of a fallacy to think that English means that US audiences are a target. So, for example, we've analyzed Facebook advertisements run by English language Chinese state media pages, and we found that these ads were actually targeted at all countries around the world, including the United States, of course, but also, for example, Pakistan, India, Germany, Indonesia, South Africa. In separate research, we've showed a map including which countries were targeted in Chinese state media, Facebook advertisements, how often. And if you take a look at that map, you'll see that pretty much every country in the world has had at least some kind of advertisement shown there. So Chinese state media use Facebook and other Western social media platforms to cultivate global audiences, to push out messages that are in line with Chinese foreign policy goals.
Interesting. So they're advertising on these platforms to other countries and particularly regional contexts. Do you know, are these classified as political ads or are they kind of like marketing ads?
Yeah, so the analysis that we did was only on ads that are classified as political and social, because those are the kinds of ads that get saved in the Facebook ad library. So if you just run an advertisement saying, look at these cute Chinese pandas, if I'm trying to research a page posting this advertisement, I can see the advertisement while it's run, but after it's deactivated, I can no longer look at it. So this targeting around the world was specifically on social and political ads, like, for example, saying that China's COVID response was especially successful and things like that.
Yeah, it's just interesting that those would be kind of flagged as political, but still let to be allowed on the platform.
I mean, a lot of them were actually taken down retroactively because they were run without the label. But I think if they were run with the label, they would have been within the allowed policy.
Interesting. So this was kind of, this was an early adoption by these Chinese state media outlets on the Western platforms. But if I read the report right, it's only in 2019 that Chinese state diplomats started taking up active Twitter presences. And so I wanted to ask, why do you think there's such a time lag between when the state media outlets got on social media and when these Chinese diplomats did?
Yeah, it definitely seems like a newer feature in China's outwards communication strategy for diplomats and also embassies to go on Twitter and post sometimes pretty inflammatory comments on their official verified Twitter accounts. One thing to consider for this timeline is the fact that China's foreign policy strategy has changed significantly since 2009. Back then, a really popular phrase on China's place in the world was hide your strength, bide your time. And what this means was that the Chinese government did not assert itself strongly on the world stage, but instead kind of tried to maintain a low profile to achieve foreign policy goals and to avoid harming relations with the international community, and played a big role in China's incredible economic growth. Since Xi Jinping became the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and also president of China around 2013, this policy has successively been turned on its head. And in recent years, Chinese foreign policy has been significantly more overt and outspoken than it had been in, say, 2009. So that in itself kind of gives a bigger, louder role to diplomats and embassies. In addition to that, 2019 is also when there were several prominent reports in Western media, like in the New York Times, on China's infamous forced labor camps, what China calls re-education camps. An estimated 1 million Uyghurs, who are members of an ethnic minority group living in Xinjiang, which is an autonomous region in Western China, are held in these camps against their will. And at the same time, the summer of 2019 is when the Hong Kong protests took off, with Twitter being a really prominent platform in Hong Kong. And many popular Hong Kong pro-democracy figures have pretty significant follower accounts on Twitter. And so I think to some extent, this increased presence by Chinese diplomat accounts on Twitter is to counter voices criticizing China's policies and the CCP in particular.
Interesting. And I think we'll get into it a bit later, but there was even a term in the report for it that was called, I think, wolf warrior diplomacy.
Yeah, correct.
Can you describe what that is?
Yeah, so this term kind of is based off a movie. The wolf warrior diplomacy means when a diplomat is, inflammatory online, you're saying, oh, look at all the great things China is doing, and then at the same time criticizing foreign governments pretty harshly, which a lot of people are saying that's not real diplomacy,
Right. It's more just a attack, more or less.
Right.
Interesting. I got to find that movie. I do like the term wolf warrior diplomacy. And, all the things you've been talking about, these state accounts and the diplomatic accounts, these are examples of what the report calls overt channels for online propaganda, right? They're not hidden. But the more interesting stuff, perhaps, is the type of covert strategies that the CCP sort of engages in, such as content farms, and there's this infamous 50-cent army. So can you describe some of these covert strategies that you uncovered in the report, and what makes them difficult to attribute to the Chinese government?
Yeah, so first, content farms are websites that mass produce articles written in some kind of clickbait way. And this is aimed to generate traffic onto a website, and in some cases to then make money through ads on the website. So sometimes the motivation for a content farm can be financial. And a different motivation would be political or social interests. So sharing certain narratives to reach an audience and to try to influence their thinking on an issue. Content farms can also, for example, use social media to share links to their pages and increase traffic that way. So, for example, a content farm owner could create or buy Facebook groups and then regularly post links to articles on the content farm website in the group, kind of hoping that group members will then go and click on the link to the article. And it's really hard to say who owns which content farm and how their content is distributed, which also means it's really hard to, for example, look at a content farm and say this one is run by the Chinese government or on behalf of the Chinese government, because of course they're going to try to hide their affiliation. And there's not much research out there on this so far. My colleague Carly Miller dove deep into the topic to find what we shared in the report. And one thing that we found was that content farms with China-related content are usually based in China, Malaysia, or Taiwan, and their content targets really a variety of audiences, like, for example, the Chinese diaspora. Another part of China's covert tactics, what you mentioned, the 50-cent army or party, they're covert accounts on social media platforms, including on Western social media platforms. And we don't know how many people this 50-cent party includes, but the more credible estimates that are out there say that it's between hundreds of thousands up to 2 million people. And these accounts are then told to spread positive energy online. And what they do is comment on social media and on news articles, both inside of China and abroad. And their job is to make the CCP and its policies look good, or just to distract real online participants from more controversial conversations. They're also active on a range of Western social media platforms, for example, on Twitter. And we know that because Twitter has, since summer of 2019, been publishing data sets of accounts that Twitter removed because they're found to be part of a Chinese government-related covert effort. And then other campaigns have been observed, for example, on LinkedIn or Reddit, so really a broad range of platforms. And like in the content farm case, it's really hard to attribute accounts or campaigns to, for example, the Chinese government. So researchers like us rely on platforms like Twitter, looking at their internal data and then saying, okay, we strongly believe these accounts are being run by the Chinese government, so we remove them. And then publishing data sets on content by these accounts, so we as researchers can then analyze China's tactics and methods.
And follow-up question about this 50-cent army. The name 50 cent comes from the fact that they're paid approximately this amount per comment, or something about them being remunerated by the Chinese government, right?
Yeah, so the term was coined, I think, because that was the thinking that, it's a lot of people that get paid for each social media post that they make. A more recent research, I think, from the mid-2010s looked at leaked documents related to this effort. And what they actually found was that a lot of commenters in the 50-cent army or party are government employees, that their main job is actually something else, but this is a part of their responsibilities. So we actually don't know if they're actually paid 50 cents per post, or if this is like some kind of other incentive structure behind that.
But it's important, I think, because it reflects the kind of broader strategy, I think. Do I have it right that these 50-cent army troops, they're generally posting positive comments, right? I'm trying to kind of compare them to the Russian troll farms, which was much more divisive. Is that right?
Yeah, so they're more like cheerleading, saying positive things, commenting on Chinese government websites and praising the government, or distracting from topics. But you're right in that they're not, posting something super divisive or trying to argue with people on some kind of topic.
So I want to return to that Russia-China comparison towards the end, but let's go through some of the case studies that were in the report. So there was one on the 2019 Hong Kong protest, then the 2020 Taiwan presidential election, and more recently, the COVID pandemic. And I just want to highlight, one or two things from each case study. I'll link to the whole report in the show notes for interested listeners to go and read more in depth. But looking at the Hong Kong protest first, as you mentioned, it's an interesting case because it's the first time that Western social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter publicly attributed an information influence operation to China. And while a number of fake accounts were discovered, posting during the protest, what's interesting is that they tended to get very little engagement and they didn't really have well-established personas. They were pretty clearly fake profiles. So why do you think the Chinese government's use of these accounts was, as the report puts it, sloppy?
That is a good question. Even in the more recent attributed accounts, Twitter released another China attributed data set in June this year, and we looked at that one too. Even in these more recent takedowns, China's execution of the accounts seems pretty sloppy. It does seem like their current covert strategy is not yet that well developed. So while Russia has moved on to more sophisticated methods that are far more difficult to detect, what we're still seeing in China's methods is a general sloppiness and prioritizing quantity over quality. And even the most recent account takedown that I mentioned, Twitter actually said that most of the over 170,000 accounts that were taken down were detected early on. And we saw their engagement, so their numbers of likes and retweets and replies that they got on their tweets was really pretty low. So why is it sloppy? I guess my best guess would be that they simply don't have the capacity yet. But considering China's resources and interest in controlling the narrative, I wouldn't be surprised to see them get significantly better at it over time, maybe learning from Russia or other more successful actors.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. I forget off the top of my head what the number was, but it was really such a small amount of those fake accounts got like one like or one retweet. They almost made, no impact on the conversation.
Yeah, we were surprised to see the numbers. They're really, really low.
Interesting. So moving on to the Taiwanese election, and I may have this wrong actually, because as I read the report, we've been talking about how China generally stays away from being, divisive or interfering in elections. They tend to just promote kind of positive narratives about China. But the case was a little bit different in the Taiwanese election, as I read it, where there was a bit of a more concerted disinformation campaign on Facebook, YouTube, and Line, which is a messaging app popular in Taiwan, but also Japan. Most of the Chinese influence operations, as we talked about, they tend to be positive, but this seemed to be a bit more negative. And so do I have that right? Or can you describe what you guys found around the Taiwanese elections?
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you're bringing it up this way, and you have that completely right. One difference regarding Chinese influence operations targeting Taiwan versus targeting other countries is that the Chinese government sees Taiwan as a part of China. So, for example, while the CCP would like to have a good image in, say, Germany and China favorable policies implemented by the German government, in Taiwan, the goals are much more fundamental. China's influence operations targeting Taiwan are not just trying to promote a positive image of China as a part of Chinese foreign policy. Instead, what they're trying to do is undermine and delegitimize Taiwan's democracy and democratic processes. And that's something that China doesn't aim to do elsewhere, at least as far as we are seeing right now. So given this context, I think it's not surprising to see China go and try to influence broad election narratives, discredit the candidate that they did not want to see winning, who, by the way, won by a significant margin and with historically high numbers of votes, and for China to try and boost the candidate that they would have preferred. Overall, our take on the Taiwan case was that China seemed to spend more effort targeting Taiwan in the form of traditional narrative propaganda rather than covertly on social media. And this could be because of the backlash that China received to its covert operations targeting Hong Kong during the 2019 protests, or because some large media entities in Taiwan have pretty close ties to Beijing and will publish Beijing-aligned messaging and narratives. And given the low level of sophistication of China's covert efforts, at least so far, this traditional media route seems like an easier way to influence the narrative in Taiwan.
Yeah, I guess there's probably something there with Taiwan being this contested territory, maybe incentivizes a bit more aggressive tactics.
Definitely. I mean, it's not just a foreign policy,
Mm-hmm, exactly. So moving to the last case study, which was looking at the coronavirus pandemic, and obviously that has some clear potential ramifications for the Chinese government in terms of their reputation. What are some of the tactics that the CCP is employing during the pandemic, and is there anything new this time around?
Yeah. So what we saw when we looked at this overall was that China deployed tactics across the spectrum of overt and covert, so including state media, diplomats and their social media presence, and covert accounts, for example, on Twitter. One important part of controlling the narrative was censorship of individuals and information channels within China. For example, whistleblowers were detained, interrogated, or disappeared, and some of them are still missing today, over 5 months later. And at the same time, journalists from foreign media, including from the New York Times and the Washington Post, were expelled from China. And so this censorship of domestic information channels, together with expulsions of foreign media, allowed China to control the narrative about the outbreak within China. Another tactic we observed was that Chinese state media that are quite present on non-Chinese social media, as I mentioned before, they use targeted Facebook ads to reach audiences around the world and to, in that way, spread the preferred CCP narrative to audiences all across the globe. One more interesting behavior that played out openly on social media, especially on Twitter, was the wolf warrior diplomacy that we talked about earlier, meaning that a lot of diplomats were criticizing other governments pretty harshly, praising the CCP and spreading CCP narratives, including on whether the coronavirus originated in China or not. And the last thing I'd like to highlight was that when we analyzed the data set of covert Twitter accounts that were attributed to the Chinese government, what we saw was that the narratives that they were pushing were pretty similar to those that we saw openly promoted in Chinese state media. What I'd say was new in the COVID case overall, one, the significant involvement by the wolf warrior type diplomats. So, for example, Chinese diplomat Zhao Lijian, who has a quite popular Twitter account with over 750,000 followers now, was especially prominent in this. And he shared a tweet back in March where he was saying that it might be the US Army who brought the epidemic to Wuhan. And he claimed that the US owed an explanation. And we actually tracked this conspiracy theory about US Army involvement on social media, and we found evidence of it from as early as late January. So this wasn't a novel idea that Zhao was spreading per se, but what he did was elevate this conspiracy theory to significant attention, and it caused quite a bit of a backlash from American policymakers and analysts. So yes, this kind of borderline conspiracy theory involvement from Chinese diplomats at such a scale definitely seems like a newer feature here. Another thing that I found notable, and we've mentioned this before, but this use of Facebook ads. I've looked at all Facebook ads run by Chinese state media over the past year and a half or so, and no topic has gotten as much coverage in ads as COVID-19, not even the Hong Kong protests. So really, over a third of the state media ads that were run by Chinese state media over a period of 18 months, a third of those were run within just 3 months that were at the peak of the pandemic earlier in spring.
That's interesting. And I'm thinking about, trying to connect these ads to the sock puppets that, we don't really know how effective these ads can be. We had a previous episode on if you target an extrovert with an extroverted ad, that seems to have some, short-term effect. But I wonder, it's a clear signal, right, that the government is investing resources to change the narrative, but it's still, I wonder if they're as amateur in their targeting as they are in their bot accounts.
Yeah, so when we look at the kind of data that we as researchers have insight to from Facebook ad targeting, we can see kind of broad geographic targeting. And to me, it wasn't really clear if there was some kind of strategy on, which ad is showed in which specific part of the world. So, maybe you're right. Maybe it was pretty amateur, but that's really hard to say with the kind of insight that we were able to get.
Definitely. I'm just also working with some Facebook ads in a different context, and we really don't have a measure of how effective they are, but definitely can see, what's going on the back end in terms of targeting and ad spend. But, in terms of the timing, I think for me, the most interesting part of the report was looking at the timing of these different strategies, and particularly how late these sock puppet and bot accounts came in. At least according to Facebook and Twitter, their first public proclamation using their internal data was 2019. And so I'm wondering, do you think that China was maybe inspired by, all this talk around disinformation and, Russian IRA troll farms to start testing some of these strategies a bit later than perhaps you might expect.
That might be the case. I think it could also be that China just decided to expand existing domestic capabilities that have been around definitely since well before 2019. The sloppiness has kind of surprised researchers since it seems like the Chinese government is more effective at these kinds of operations domestically. I guess if they're trying to learn from Russia and if they're inspired from Russia, there's still significant differences and gaps in their sophistication and approach.
Which leads right into my next question. Can you outline some of these differences between overall the Chinese and Russian influence operations?
Yeah, so maybe instead of framing it in differences, framing it in terms of goals and tactics, because I think there's just really significant differences. So Russian goals are to confuse, to undermine trust in the democratic process. They have a high sophistication, and in Russian operations that target the United States, for example, they're trying to weaken the United States. China, on the other hand, is trying to make China look good or better vis-a-vis the United States, both in its influence operations that target the US, but also third country operations. And tactics, so what Russia does, they inflame existing tensions, and they use a lot of covert activity to do that. China, on the other hand, is trying to paint a positive image of China, and a lot of that is done through overt channels. And when we analyzed covert content from Chinese accounts, what we saw was that the narrative in the covert activity actually mirrored that was shared through overt channels. So, for example, in the context of COVID-19, the covert accounts were praising the Chinese government, calling on Chinese unity, and criticizing others in their COVID response. And that's pretty much exactly what Chinese state media were talking about at the same time. And overall, I think China just has more of an alternative than other players because of its really robust state media apparatus and all the media outlets like thousands of TV channels, radio stations, and newspapers that are owned by China abroad that China can also use to spread its message.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the report really compares China and Russia in depth along these lines, because that's kind of the two most notable examples recently, along with Iran and the cyber attacks and all that. But I'm wondering about the US and all of this. And there have been some suggested uses of social media technologies in Cuba, for example, by the US. And I'm just wondering, do you have any insight on what the US capabilities are in this area and why the US is kind of left out of this conversation between China, Russia, and Iran in terms of influence operations?
Yeah, so overall on US capabilities and how they deploy them, no, the US does not deploy any of the tactics that, for example, China and Russia do. The US does have overt media entities that are associated with the government through the US Agency for Global Media, like the Voice of America. And these entities, to some extent, promote American views on different topics abroad. But even if the properties in the Agency for Global Media were as closely controlled by the US government as Chinese state media or Russian state media are, which, by the way, I don't think that's the case, that would still not give the US government anything similar in terms of controlling the narrative, since these outlets would still compete with the media mainstream. And unlike state media in China or Russia, the US media properties only represent a really small share of the overall media environment. And as for covert capabilities, I'm not aware of any covert social media campaigns orchestrated by the US government. There has been criticism of the overt media entities that I mentioned, especially when recently, I think over the past few weeks, the heads of Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, among others, were pushed out when a Trump ally became CEO of the agency. And, some people are seeing, they're worried that the Voice of America is turning into the voice of Trump. But I think despite some legitimate criticism, all of this is happening at a much smaller scale than in China or in Russia. Chinese or Russian properties have time and again proven that they lack any kind of editorial independence. For example, research by one of my colleagues at the Stanford Internet Observatory, who has looked at Russian state media and their narratives on COVID, shows that Russian state media's editorial line is really subordinated to the Russian government's geopolitical strategy. So, for example, Russian state media was criticizing lockdowns and mask wearing in the United States, but was praising the exact same thing in Russia and in China. And beyond that, the media properties of the Agency for Global Media are small properties in comparison with the mainstream media. So I don't think U.S. tactics or capabilities and influence operations compare at all to those from, say, Russia or China.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, but yeah, I guess the free press kind of works against compared to other regimes. But I think it's super interesting, especially now looking at China, because as we've discussed in the Hong Kong protest, we're seeing new things emerge sort of day by day and with COVID. So Vanessa, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, thank you for your great questions and great conversation with you.
I've just been speaking with Vanessa Molter, graduate research assistant at the Stanford Internet Observatory. If you want to read her report, you can find a link to it down in the show notes. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Andre Haller and Simon Krasinski about data-driven campaigning in Germany. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.